Welcome, everyone, to a spirited discussion between two contrasting minds in economics. Representing the Austrian School, we have an economist who champions praxeology and free market principles. Opposing him is an economist from the Chicago School, a staunch advocate of empirical analysis and monetarist ideas. Today, they will debate methodology and modern economic issues with sharp wit and intellectual vigor. Let's start with the fundamentals. Economics can be approached very differently by your two schools. Austrian economist, you rely on praxeology, logical reasoning from self-evident axioms. Chicago economist, you emphasize empirical analysis and data. Why is your method superior, and what do you think of the other's approach?
Why is our method superior? Because it starts from something real, human action. Economics isn't a physics experiment with controlled variables. It's the study of purposeful human behavior. We Austrians deduce economic laws from the axiom that humans act with intention. This praxeological approach is logically airtight. I don't need to torture data on a spreadsheet to know that if you fix a price below market level, a shortage will occur, or that printing piles of money eventually will debase the currency. It's common sense derived from sound logic.
Logical airtightness, you say? More like a self-referential bubble. Sure, humans act, but acting on your assumptions alone and calling the conclusions economic laws sounds more like theology than science. We Chicago economists treat economics as an empirical social science. We develop hypotheses and test them against real-world data. If the facts contradict our theory, we revise the theory. You might try it sometime instead of clutching your leather-bound copy of Mises and declaring victory. Evidence might be messy, but it's the only way to know if your elegant praxeological deductions have any bearing on reality.
Test them against data? How quaint. The problem is your data is always from the past, describing unique historical conditions that will never repeat exactly. You guys run endless regressions trying to isolate variables in a complex economy as if it were a lab experiment. But human action isn't repeatable like a chemistry test. Circumstances change, people learn. There are no constants in economics to measure. Praxeology recognizes this by focusing on qualitative cause and effect. For instance, if you flood the market with new money, someone benefits at the expense of others. Ever heard of the Cantillon effect? Meanwhile, your empirical models often mistake correlation for causation, and then fall apart when a crisis hits that wasn't in your dataset. Tell me, how many Chicago School models predicted the 2008 financial crisis or the inflation surge in 2022? My point exactly.
And how many Austrian treatises predicted those exact events either? None. They only claim credit after the fact, with a narrative that can't be tested. You dismiss data as unique historical conditions, and then spin yarns about cause and effect that conveniently can't be falsified. That's not science. That's unfalsifiable dogma. Sure, our models aren't perfect. Economics is hard. But at least we learn from the data and refine our understanding over time. You Austrians just declare your theory correct a priori and blame any real-world deviations on, impure conditions or government meddling. It's like a weather forecaster who claims they're never wrong. It's the weather that refuses to cooperate.
The weather analogy is cute, but when you keep adding ad hoc patches to your theory after each failed prediction, maybe the problem is the theory itself. Leans forward. Our view is that economics must start from undeniable truths about human behavior, not endless number crunching. But fine. Let's talk about those real-world conditions you love so much.
Turning to monetary policy, central banks like the Federal Reserve have implemented unprecedented measures in recent years. Near-zero interest rates, quantitative easing, and now rapidly rising rates in response to inflation. What are your views on central banking and its role in the recent inflation surge? Should we reform the Fed, abolish it, or trust it more?
Central banking is the problem, not the solution. The Federal Reserve and its counterparts are basically central planners for money, and we know how well central planning works, about as well as a lead balloon. The Fed held interest rates near zero for years, printed trillions to bankroll government spending sprees, and now they act surprised that we have the worst inflation in 40 years. It's textbook Austrian business cycle. They created an artificial boom with easy money, which led to malinvestments, housing bubbles, zombie companies living on cheap debt, you name it. And when reality catches up, we get a bust or roaring inflation or both. My view? The best reform for the Fed is to eventually abolish it. Return money to the market. Whether that's a gold-backed system, competing private currencies, or heck, even cryptocurrency. Anything is better than a handful of bureaucrats deciding the price of money like Soviet commissars deciding bread prices.
Abolish the Fed? Right, because unregulated private banking never led to financial crises. 19th century bank runs. Look, I'll agree the Fed overshot with the easy money recently. Even some of us empirical types warned that pumping the money supply like a fire hose would spark inflation. Milton Friedman famously said, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon," and the Fed certainly put that on display. But the answer isn't to toss central banking in the trash. It's to run it better. The Fed should follow clear, rule-based policies, say, target a low and stable inflation rate or a steady growth of the money supply, instead of ad hoc whims and political pressure. A well-run central bank can provide stability, acting as a lender of last resort to stop bank panics and managing the money supply so we don't get either runaway inflation or deep deflation. You want to hand over the monetary system to gold miners or cryptocurrency miners and assume that will magically be more stable? That's a fantasy. We tried the gold standard. It had panics galore and contributed to the Great Depression when central banks tightened at the worst time. I'd rather improve the Fed than live in some wild west of money.
Yes, thank God for the Fed's stability. Like the stable dollar that has lost over 95% of its value since the Fed's founding. Some stability. And you cite the 19th century, sure, there were bank runs, often triggered by regulations and legal quirks of that era, by the way. Free banking with optional gold backing in places like Scotland worked quite well historically. The Great Depression? That was the Fed's doing too. They blew up the roaring 20s with easy credit and then totally bungled the response when things collapsed. Even your hero Friedman admitted the Fed helped cause the Depression by shrinking the money supply when it should have provided liquidity. Central planners gonna plan badly. As for a rule-based Fed, I'll grant, if we must suffer a central bank, better it follow rules than the current discretionary charade. But even rules can be wrong or too rigid. Why not just let the market set the rules organically? Competing currencies might sound wild to you, but competition tends to discipline even money. And yes, I would trust a well-designed cryptocurrency, or a gold standard, over an ever-expanding fiat money supply. At least gold can't be conjured out of thin air by a committee that meets 8 times a year. The only thing the Fed has consistently stabilized is the government's ability to rack up debt, and a perpetual cycle of bubbles.
The dollar lost 95% of its value over a century, but real incomes rose and living standards skyrocketed, didn't they? I'd call that a pretty successful run for an economy, some inflation notwithstanding. A slowly depreciating dollar underpins growth as long as it's predictable and modest. What matters is not that a Coke cost a nickel in 1913 and $1 today. What matters is how many minutes a worker must labor to earn that dollar. By that measure, we're far better off. And your faith in unregulated free banking is touching, but remember that even minor. Financial panics in the 1800s caused massive hardship. The Fed was created precisely because the market-led system failed one too many times. As Panic of 1907. Ring a bell? I'm not saying the Fed is infallible, far from it. It has a lot to improve, like not flooding the economy preemptively or ignoring asset bubbles. But throwing it out entirely is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We can institute a rules-based framework, say a Taylor rule or an NGDP target, to guide policy and avoid both high inflation and deep recessions. Your solution of multiple private currencies sounds like a recipe for chaos. The word currency comes from current, as in flow. Having competing streams of money sounds like a good way to drown commerce in confusion. Even crypto, which we'll get to later, wildly swings in value. How's that for stability? I'd rather have the Fed with all its flaws than a return to the financial Wild West.
Let's turn to the role of government in the economy. We've seen massive government spending in recent years, stimulus checks, bailouts, trillion-dollar infrastructure plans, and huge deficits. There's also ongoing debate over taxation and regulations. Some even claim deficits don't matter as long as we can print money, so-called modern monetary theory. Austrian Economist, how do you view government intervention and spending? And Chicago Economist, where do you stand?
The government should stick to the absolute bare bones, if that. Instead, it's become a gigantic busybody, spending money like a drunken sailor. Except the sailor spends his own money, and the government spends ours, or prints it anew. These multi-trillion-dollar spending sprees are paid for by either taxing us now, borrowing, taxing us later, or just conjuring money out of thin air, which devalues every dollar in our wallets. You mentioned modern monetary theory? That's just a fancy academic cover for an age-old fantasy. That we can have unlimited spending with no consequence, as if printing money were a magic wand. Newsflash, there is no free lunch. Piling up debt and printing dollars to cover it will either lead to higher taxes, inflation, or default. Pick your poison. Government intervention, be it stimulus programs, price controls, or mountains of regulations, just distorts the market's natural self-correction mechanisms. Let entrepreneurs and consumers, not bureaucrats, drive the economy. In short, /spending/taxes and let the free market do its job. If that sounds radical, it's only because we've drifted so far into government overreach.
I'm hardly a fan of big government myself. Remember, the Chicago School often advocates free markets too, but I wouldn't dismantle everything overnight. Government has some legitimate roles: enforcing property rights, basic regulation to prevent fraud or environmental harm, providing public goods like national defense. That said, the recent spending binge was excessive. Yes, some emergency spending during the pandemic was necessary to prevent total collapse. Even we pragmatists acknowledge a need for a safety net in a crisis. But politicians didn't know when to stop. They treated the Treasury and Fed like an ATM. Now we have $30 plus trillion in national debt and rising inflation. Even Keynes's that old bogeyman of both our schools would blanch at the scale of deficits we've run outside of a major war. On modern monetary theory, or as I call it, magic money tree, it's dangerous nonsense. The idea that deficits don't matter because we can print our own currency is a siren song for spendthrift politicians. Eventually, excessive debt either crowds out private investment or forces the central bank to monetize it, fueling inflation. There's no cheat code to avoid economic reality. So yes, we need fiscal discipline. But unlike my Austrian friend, I don't equate all taxation with theft. We need some taxes to fund essential services. The goal should be to make taxation as efficient and least distortive as possible. Simplify the tax code, broaden the base, lower rates. Maybe a flat tax or a consumption tax would work better than the labyrinth we have now. We can disagree on the ideal size of government, but surely we can agree that whatever it does, it should do efficiently and within its means.
Efficiently and within its means? That's like asking a wolf to eat tofu. Governments, by nature, overspend other people's money inefficiently. I'm glad we both think the recent binge was insane. And I'm delighted to hear you torch MMT as the quackery it is. But you still have more faith in the state than I do. Essential services, you say? Most of what the government labels essential could be handled better privately. Education, infrastructure, even security. There are examples of private solutions in each. Competition breeds efficiency, monopolies breed complacency, and government is the mother of all monopolies. And taxation is theft, philosophically speaking. If I took a third of your income at gunpoint to spend on my pet projects, you'd call it theft. Doing it with a tax code and bureaucracy doesn't change the ethics. That said, I understand we need some minimal funds for a night watchman state, courts, police, basic defense, but we're far beyond that. Today, government is a sprawling octopus, and each tentacle costs money. High taxation and spending also sap the economy's vitality by undermining incentives. Why invest or work hard if bureaucrats will confiscate a huge chunk? The Laffer curve, which I'm sure you're aware of, suggests there's a point where higher tax rates reduce revenue because they choke growth. I say we aim for the lowest possible tax that can fund the truly essential few functions, and no more.
I expected the taxation is theft line, and you delivered. Philosophical theatrics aside, let's talk practicalities. Even a minimal state costs something. You conceded courts, police, defensos aren't free. We might disagree on what counts as essential beyond that, but okay, government should stick to things markets truly can't handle well. I'm with you on cutting waste and boondoggles. And yes, bureaucracies can be terribly inefficient. The joke that a government economist is someone who wonders if what works in practice can work in theory has a ring of truth. Still, some interventions do correct market failures. Take pollution. Without any regulation, we'd rely on polluters to grow a conscience or on victims to somehow coordinate and sue. Not very efficient. A carbon tax or some regulation can address that externality in a market-compatible way. The Chicago approach often favors market-based solutions like tradable permits or school vouchers, using choice and competition to improve outcomes within a framework set by government. That's worlds apart from central planning or Soviet-style control, and it's a far cry from the socialist nightmare you paint whenever the word government is uttered. In short, government should be limited but not lobotomized. And absolutely, let's demand it live within its means. Balanced budgets over the business cycle. No unfunded entitlements wishfully kicked down to future generations. On that, I suspect we find more common ground than the fireworks suggest.
Speaking of alternatives to government-issued money, let's talk about cryptocurrency. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have emerged as potential challengers to fiat currency and central banking. Austrian Economist, do you see crypto as the free market money you've been waiting for? Chicago Economist, do you think cryptocurrencies are a viable money or just a speculative craze?
Cryptocurrency, now we're talking. Bitcoin in particular warms an Austrian's heart. It's decentralized, not controlled by any government or central bank, and its supply is capped in code. In other words, no bureaucrat can print more Bitcoin on a whim. That's basically digital gold. Many of us in the Austrian camp see Bitcoin as a realization of the sound money principles we've long advocated. It's a voluntary currency chosen by market participants, not imposed by fiat, and it's been a godsend in places where government money is a disaster. Think of people in Venezuela or Argentina escaping hyperinflation by parking their savings in Bitcoin or stablecoins. Sure, crypto is volatile in dollar terms right now, but that's the early adoption phase. Over time, as trust and usage grow, a cryptocurrency could stabilize and serve as a widespread medium of exchange. The volatility argument cuts both ways. Fiat can be plenty volatile when mismanaged. Just ask anyone who lived through 20% inflation or a currency collapse. I'd take Bitcoin's built-in discipline over the Fed's promises any day.
I had a feeling you'd be a Bitcoin enthusiast. I'll grant that cryptocurrency is an intriguing innovation. The blockchain technology behind it has potential for things like secure transactions, contracts, and more. But as a currency replacement? Color me skeptical. Money has three functions: unit of account, medium of exchange, store of value. Crypto thus far fails the first two for the most part. Almost no one prices their goods in Bitcoin, and it's not widely accepted for everyday transactions. It's mostly used as a speculative store of value, and an extremely volatile one at that. 1 month Bitcoin is up 50%. The next it's down 50%. That might thrill day traders, but it makes for a lousy stable currency. Businesses can't budget or pay salaries in a unit that behaves like a roller coaster. And while you mention countries with collapsing currencies, sure, in extremis people will try anything: cigarettes, seashells, Bitcoin, but that doesn't make it an ideal standard in normal times. There's also the issue of what backs cryptocurrency. Essentially, it's valuable because people believe it is, kind of like fiat, but without even a government or economy underpinning it. At least the dollar is backed by the US government's ability to tax in that currency and the whole US economy's output. Bitcoin is backed by the hope that someone else will want it. And don't get me started on the hordes of altcoins. Many are outright scams or are extremely centralized despite all the decentralized rhetoric. Lastly, if cryptocurrencies truly threaten to replace fiat on a large scale, do you think governments would just sing kumbaya and let it happen? They'd regulate or outlaw it into the ground if it undermined their monetary sovereignty or facilitated rampant crime. So, interesting experiment, yes. Gold too that ends central banking? I'm not convinced.
You say Bitcoin isn't backed by anything, but neither is fiat, except the government's word. And history is littered with governments breaking their word and inflating or defaulting. Bitcoin is backed by math, code, and a network of users who voluntarily trust it because the rules are transparent and can't be changed on a politician's whim. I'd argue that's a stronger foundation than because I said so legal tender. And about volatility, all new assets are volatile as they find their market value. Early on, even stocks in emerging industries swing wildly. Over a longer horizon, Bitcoin's trajectory has been upward as adoption grows, and its volatility has gradually decreased. If it ever became as widely used as, say, the dollar, its price stability would likely improve dramatically. Basic economics of a thicker market. On usage, true, few people price their lattes in Bitcoin today, but more and more do use it for transactions, or use crypto platforms that convert it on the fly behind the scenes. The ecosystem is evolving fast: Lightning Network, stablecoins, etc. Stablecoins, by the way, show how people crave stability, but also an alternative to local fiat. Many are essentially private digital dollars. The point is, crypto is pushing us toward monetary choice. Even if it never fully replaces fiat, its mere existence forces central banks to reckon with competition. Why do you think the Fed and other central banks are suddenly talking about central bank digital currencies, CBDCs? They're trying to co-opt the innovation. But a CBDC is just fancy fiat, still centrally controlled, and ripe for Orwellian oversight, I might add. I'd rather put my faith in open source, market-driven money. Crypto may not be perfect, but it's a welcome check on the monopoly power of central banks.
I'll watch crypto's development with an open mind, but also a healthy dose of caution. You have a knack for idealizing things. First it was the free market solving everything, now it's Bitcoin riding in to save us from the Fed. Maybe you're right that it will mature and stabilize, or maybe it'll crash and burn, or get co-opted by governments. Remember, tech fads come and go. A few years ago, Bitcoin was barreling toward $100,000, and everyone on the internet was a genius. Then it crashed spectacularly, and many latecomers got burned. That kind of wild ride doesn't inspire confidence in a stable monetary system. And while I agree that central banks exploring CBDCs is partly a response to crypto, I don't see it as proof that Bitcoin will take over. It just means central banks want to modernize how they issue currency, and yes, probably keep control. Believe it or not, I'd prefer private innovation put pressure on central banks to behave better. Competition can work in strange ways. If crypto remains a niche asset class, fine. If it truly proves to be superior at providing a stable, efficient medium of exchange that people trust, then by all means, the better currency should win. I'm just not convinced we're there yet. For now, I'll stick with advocating reforms to make fiat policy saner, and you can hodl your Bitcoin stash. Let's reconvene in 10 years and see who was right about crypto.
We're almost out of time. In 1 or 2 sentences, what's your closing message or takeaway from this debate?
Ultimately, my perspective boils down to this. Trust in the voluntary interactions of free people over the edicts of technocrats. Sound money, low taxes, and minimal government interference create the best environment for prosperity and individual freedom. Economics is about human action, and humans flourish most when their choices aren't muzzled by central planners.
And my takeaway, use theory, but verify with reality. Markets are powerful and generally best at allocating resources, but we should temper ideology with evidence. A prudent mix of free markets, limited government, and data-driven policy gives us the best shot at stable growth and innovation. In short, let's be guided by what actually works, not just what we think should work in theory.
Thank you both for an enlightening and entertaining debate. It seems that while you share some common ground in your love of free markets, your clashes on methodology and the proper extent of government intervention will keep economics seminars lively for years to come. And to our audience, thank you for joining us in this clash of economic titans.